September 10th, 1943. The morning sun climbed over the broken walls of a farmhouse outside Salerno, where Sergeant Marco Bellini of the Italian Army's 34th Infantry Division sat with his hands bound loosely behind him. He was 26 years old, hollow-cheeked, and hungry in a way that had become his permanent condition. Around him, 14 other Italian soldiers waited in similar postures of exhausted surrender, guarded by 3 American GIs who seemed more interested in opening tin cans than watching their prisoners. What happened next would shatter everything Bellini thought he understood about this war. One of the Americans, a baby-faced private who couldn't have been more than 19, approached with something in his hand. Bellini tensed, expecting interrogation, perhaps a cigarette in exchange for information. Instead, the American extended a can toward him, its key dangling from the side. The label read words Bellini didn't recognize. The private made an eating gesture, then set the can in Bellini's lap and walked away. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Bellini stared at the object as though it might explode. Behind him, another prisoner whispered in Sicilian dialect that the Americans were sharing their rations with them, not selling them, not trading them, sharing them freely. This single act would become the first crack in a worldview built on 3 years of fascist propaganda and 20 months of desperate hunger. For Sergeant Bellini and thousands of Italian soldiers like him who surrendered or were captured during the Allied invasion of Italy, the revelation wasn't delivered through speeches or manifestos. It came through the simple, undeniable evidence of what American soldiers ate, and more impossibly, what they were willing to give away. The Italian army had entered World War II in June 1940, with grand ambitions and insufficient preparation. The prescribed daily ration for Italian soldiers at the front, according to regulations issued by the Ministry of War, included 630 grams of bread, 240 grams of meat, 350 grams of vegetables, 40 grams of butter or olive oil, 30 grams of fish, and assorted other components that, on paper, totaled approximately 2,800 to 3,000 calories. This was the theory. The reality at the front bore no resemblance to these figures. By mid-1943, after years of war across North Africa, the Balkans, and now on Italian soil itself, the Italian military supply system had collapsed into dysfunction. Soldiers received perhaps half the prescribed rations on good days. Often they received far less. The canned meat soldiers called asino morto, dead donkey, was a bitter joke referring to the AM stamp on military rations, amministrazione militare. The contents were usually sardines or processed meat of indeterminate origin, never enough, always the same. Bellini had not seen fresh meat in 8 months. The bread issued to his unit was often extended with sawdust to make the flour stretch further. Vegetables meant whatever could be foraged or seized from civilians who had little enough themselves. On the Eastern Front, Italian soldiers in Russia had written home about boiling their belts to extract any nutritional value from the leather. In North Africa, troops drank water hauled in unwashed gasoline drums, the petroleum taste never quite disappearing, using this same water to boil the precious little pasta they received. The daily reality for Italian soldiers like Bellini probably ranged between 1,200 to 1,800 calories on average, though systematic records were not kept. This was starvation in slow motion. Men grew gaunt, their uniforms hung loose. Chronic dysentery was universal. Energy for anything beyond basic survival became a luxury. The medical consequences manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Bellini's gums bled when he tried to clean his teeth, a sign of vitamin C deficiency. His night vision had deteriorated noticeably over the past year, a symptom of insufficient vitamin A. Small wounds took weeks to heal instead of days. His hair, once thick and dark, had become brittle and sparse. The constant fatigue wasn't just exhaustion from combat, it was the body's desperate attempt to conserve energy when fuel was insufficient. Other men in his unit had suffered worse. Cases of beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, had appeared among soldiers who'd subsisted primarily on refined white rice, with little else. The disease caused painful nerve damage and heart problems. Pellagra, from lack of niacin, produced skin lesions and mental confusion. 2 men in Bellini's company had died not from enemy action but from complications of severe malnutrition, their bodies simply unable to fight off infections that healthy men would have survived easily. The Italian army's medical officers, to their credit, understood what was happening. They filed reports documenting the crisis. They pleaded for improved rations, but the logistics system couldn't deliver what didn't exist. Italian food production had declined throughout the war. Imports were increasingly difficult as Allied naval power dominated the Mediterranean. The civilian population was itself on starvation rations by 1943. There was simply nothing left to give the soldiers. And then came the Americans. The morning after his capture, Bellini watched 3 American soldiers prepare their breakfast. They opened rectangular boxes, marked with letters and colors he couldn't read. From these boxes came an abundance that defied belief. Cans of ham and eggs, biscuits that weren't moldy, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory mixture Italian soldiers had been drinking since 1941. Chocolate bars, fruit concentrate, sugar in packets, white and pure, cigarettes in every ration, even small rolls of toilet paper. The Americans ate with the casual disinterest of men who had never known true hunger. One of them scraped half a can of cheese into the dirt, complaining about the taste. Bellini's stomach twisted. That discarded cheese represented more protein than he'd consumed in a week. What Bellini couldn't know, sitting in that farmhouse watching Americans waste food, was the precise mathematics of the disparity he was witnessing. The standard American K ration, originally developed in 1941 by physiologist Ansel Keys, contained approximately 2,830 calories across 3 meals: breakfast, dinner, and supper. This was considered barely adequate, even insufficient, for troops engaged in heavy combat. American military nutritionists worried constantly that K rations provided too few calories. The K ration breakfast unit alone contained items Bellini hadn't seen in months: a 4-ounce can of chopped ham and eggs with its opening key, 4 Kone biscuits, energy crackers designed for maximum caloric density, 4 K2 compressed graham crackers, a 2-ounce fruit bar packed with concentrated sugars and vitamins, soluble coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute, 3 sugar tablets, 4 cigarettes, 1 piece of chewing gum, every component carefully selected to provide not just calories but specific nutrients the military's nutritionists had determined were essential for combat effectiveness. The dinner unit replaced the meat with processed cheese, substituted dextrose tablets for the fruit bar, included lemon juice powder rich in vitamin C. The supper unit featured a can of beef and pork loaf, a chocolate D ration bar, bouillon powder. The variety wasn't accidental. American nutritional science had advanced to the point where rations were engineered to prevent the exact deficiency diseases Bellini and his comrades suffered from. The Americans also had access to C rations, which provided approximately 2,794 calories and significantly more protein at 121 grams per day. When possible, troops received fresh food through the A ration and B ration systems, which could provide upward of 3,600 calories daily. American military doctrine called for soldiers in combat to receive between 3,200 to 4,200 calories per day, depending on conditions and physical demands. The American soldiers Bellini watched were eating more in a single day than he typically consumed in 2, sometimes 3 days, and they were complaining about it. The revelation deepened over the following days as Bellini and his fellow prisoners were processed through the American military system. At a temporary POW camp near Paestum, the captured Italians received their first American-provided meal. The scene was chaotic, tinged with disbelief bordering on hysteria. The Americans served each prisoner what they called a full ration. Bellini received a plate containing more food than he would normally see in several days. A substantial portion of canned beef stew, 2 thick slices of white bread with real butter, canned peaches in syrup, strong black coffee with sugar and condensed milk, and a chocolate bar for dessert. The bread alone, soft and white and plentiful, was a revelation. Italian bread rations had shrunk to 600 grams per day in regulation, often far less in practice. This American bread was made from flour unmixed with adulterants, baked until the crust was golden, the interior impossibly soft. Bellini ate slowly, methodically, fighting the urge to vomit from eating too much too quickly after months of deprivation. Around him, other prisoners wept openly as they ate. One man, a corporal from Napoli, repeated the same phrase over and over. "It's real. It's all real." An American medic moved through the group, warning them in broken Italian to eat slowly. "Piano, piano," he repeated, gesturing to show small bites. The medic had clearly seen this before, knew that starving men could make themselves seriously ill by eating too rapidly. He distributed packets of salt tablets and insisted the prisoners drink water between bites. This attention to their welfare, from enemy soldiers, struck Bellini as almost incomprehensible. But the psychological impact went beyond the immediate physical relief. As prisoners, the Italians naturally studied their captors, trying to understand who these Americans were and what motivated them. What they observed contradicted 3 years of fascist propaganda about American weakness, American decadence, American unwillingness to fight. The propaganda had painted a specific picture. America was a nation of gangsters and plutocrats, soft from luxury, divided by racial strife, incapable of sacrifice or sustained effort. Mussolini had characterized Americans as mongrels without culture or fighting spirit. The Italian people had been assured that American soldiers would break at the first hard blow, that American industrial might was exaggerated, that the United States lacked the will to project power across an ocean. The food itself testified against every element of this propaganda. First, there was the casual abundance. American soldiers didn't hoard their rations. They traded items they disliked for others they preferred. They gave away chocolate to children. They discarded perfectly edible food without a second thought, food that would have been precious beyond measure to any Italian soldier. This wasn't the behavior of a weak or desperate nation. This was the confidence of genuine surplus. Second, there was the systematic organization. The rations arrived on schedule, in volume, properly packaged and preserved. The Americans had overcome the enormous logistical challenge of shipping millions of tons of food across the Atlantic Ocean, then distributing it through invasion beaches under fire, then forward to frontline units fighting in difficult terrain. The Italian military had struggled to supply troops across the Mediterranean, a far shorter distance, and had failed consistently. Third, there was the variety and quality. The Americans weren't eating emergency rations or making do with whatever local supplies they could commandeer. They had brought their entire food supply system with them, an industrial apparatus capable of feeding hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of miles from home, to a higher standard than most Italian civilians ate in peacetime. Sergeant Bellini, watching American trucks arrive at the POW camp loaded with supplies, began to perform calculations that filled him with a sick understanding. Each truck carried enough food to feed his entire company for a week. The Americans had dozens of such trucks just in the area he could see. Behind those trucks were ships, behind the ships were factories. Behind the factories was an economy that could produce this abundance while simultaneously building the tanks, aircraft, and ammunition needed to fight a global war. Italy had never had anything approaching such capacity. Italian industry had been inadequate before the war, incapable of supporting modern military operations once conflict began. Italian agriculture, largely unmechanized and inefficient, had struggled to feed the civilian population even in peacetime. Adding millions of men in uniform had broken a system that was already fragile. The comparison became inescapable. On one side stood an Italy that couldn't feed its own soldiers adequate rations. On the other stood an America that not only fed its troops abundantly, but could afford to feed captured enemy soldiers better than their own army ever had. The implications were devastating. In a converted barn serving as a mess hall, Bellini encountered Private Giovanni Russo, a young Italian-American soldier from Philadelphia who'd been assigned as an interpreter. Russo spoke the Neapolitan dialect fluently, having grown up in an immigrant neighborhood. Through him, Bellini learned more about America than any fascist pamphlet had ever told him. "My father came to America with nothing," Russo explained, his Italian coloured by American rhythms. "He worked in construction. We weren't rich, understand? Working class. But we ate meat 3-4 times a week, bread every day, as much as we wanted. My mother made pasta on Sundays with real tomato sauce, olive oil, meat. That was normal for us. Normal." Bellini struggled to process this. Russo was describing what would have been luxury for most Italian families, casually stating it was ordinary working-class life in America. "Every family?" he asked. "Not just the wealthy?" Russo shrugged. "I'm not saying there's no poverty. But yeah, most families eat pretty good. We got electricity everywhere, running water, cars. Lots of people have cars. Before the war, my father was thinking about buying a second car." A second car. Bellini knew perhaps 3 families in his entire village who owned even one automobile. In America, apparently, workers considered buying a second one. The food told the story with more eloquence than any statistics could convey. It demonstrated productive capacity, organizational competence, commitment of resources, and most damning of all, a fundamental difference in economic systems. Italian fascism had promised national greatness through military strength and autarky, self-sufficiency. The promise had been a lie. Italy had entered the war dependent on imports for basic necessities, had failed to adequately feed its own population, and now its soldiers sat as prisoners, eating better under American guard than they ever had under Italian command. Among the prisoners, the discussions went deep into the night. Men who had believed in the fascist cause found their certainty eroding with each American meal. Others, who had harbored private doubts all along, felt vindicated but also profoundly angry at the deception they'd endured. "We were told America was weak," said Lieutenant Carlo Messina, a university-educated officer from Milano who sat with Bellini around a small fire. "We were told they couldn't fight, couldn't produce, couldn't sustain effort. Every part of that was a lie. They're not weak. Look at what they eat, look at what they throw away. That's not weakness. That's power beyond anything we ever had." Another prisoner, a veteran of the North African campaign named Antonio Serra, spoke with quiet bitterness. "In Tunisia, we were on half rations, then quarter rations. We joked about eating our boots. The Germans had more, but not much more. We blamed the British supply lines. We blamed the distance. We blamed everything except the truth. The truth is we never had enough, because Italy never had the industrial base to support a modern war. We sent men to fight without giving them the basic tools to succeed, including enough food to keep their bodies functioning. The anger was palpable, but it was directed inward, at themselves for believing, at their leaders for lying, at the system that had sent them to fight a war that had been lost before it started. The food was simply the most immediate, visceral evidence of a larger truth. The war had never been about military tactics or courage or fighting spirit. It had been about industrial production and logistical capability and economic power. On those measures, Italy had never stood a chance. The mathematics of calories carried implications far beyond individual hunger. A soldier consuming 1,800 calories per day lacks the energy for sustained physical exertion. His body begins cannibalizing its own muscle tissue. His cognitive function deteriorates. His immune system weakens. He becomes susceptible to disease. His combat effectiveness drops to perhaps 50% of normal, then lower. Multiply this across an entire army, and the effect is catastrophic. Italian units in North Africa had suffered not just from enemy action, but from the cumulative effects of malnutrition. Men couldn't march long distances. They couldn't dig defensive positions in hard soil. They lacked the strength to move artillery pieces. They succumbed to dysentery and malaria at rates far exceeding properly fed troops. The German Afrika Korps, fighting alongside Italian forces, had noted with concern the physical deterioration of their allies. By contrast, American forces suffered from excess. Doctors worried about troops gaining weight in garrison. Nutritionists studied whether 3,600 calories was too much for soldiers in non-combat roles. The military experimented with different ration compositions, trying to find the right balance of protein, carbohydrates, and fats. These were the concerns of an army so well supplied that its problems came from abundance rather than scarcity. At a POW compound near Caserta, several weeks after his capture, Bellini witnessed something that crystallized everything he'd been processing. The Americans were distributing the next day's rations to their own troops. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Bellini and other prisoners, assigned to labor details, watched as crates were unloaded from trucks. An American sergeant walked past carrying a case of sea rations. He stumbled, the case broke open, and a dozen cans spilled across the ground. The sergeant picked up a few, looked at the rest, and walked away, leaving perhaps 8 or 9 full cans of food lying in the dirt. Another soldier came by, glanced at the cans, took one, and continued on his way. The Italian prisoners stared at the abandoned food. Not ancient, spoiled rations that would make men sick. Fresh, perfectly good food, just sitting there because an American soldier didn't feel like bending down to pick it all up. The casual disregard for what represented precious nutrition spoke volumes about the depth of American abundance. One of the Italian prisoners, tears in his eyes, finally walked over and picked up the cans. He brought them back to the group, and they divided the food in reverent silence. Not because they were hungry at that moment, the Americans fed them adequately, but because the symbolic weight of that moment, food so abundant that it could be abandoned in the dirt, was almost too much to bear. The war continued, but for Bellini and thousands of Italian soldiers like him, the fundamental revelation had already occurred. They understood now why they'd lost, not because Italian soldiers lacked courage. Many had fought bravely, held impossible positions, endured terrible conditions with remarkable resilience. They'd lost because the entire premise of the fascist project had been built on delusion. Mussolini had promised to make Italy great through force of will and military prowess. He'd promised autarky and self-sufficiency. He'd promised that Italian discipline and spirit would overcome material disadvantages. Every promise had been false. You couldn't will industrial capacity into existence. You couldn't fight a modern war on empty stomachs. You couldn't defeat an enemy that could feed its soldiers 4,000 calories a day when your own troops were surviving on less than half that amount. The Americans, for their part, seemed largely unaware of the psychological impact their rations were having. They complained about Spam and K-ration biscuits with the enthusiasm of people who'd never known real hunger. They traded away components they disliked. They expressed surprise when Italian prisoners ate everything on their plates, including items Americans typically discarded. But some noticed. Private Russo, the Italian-American interpreter, made a point of eating meals with the prisoners sometimes, answering their questions about life in America. He explained concepts that seemed fantastic to men from rural Italian villages. Supermarkets where you could buy any food you wanted, restaurants on every corner, refrigerators in most homes, food so abundant that Americans worried about eating too much rather than too little. My grandmother, Russo told them one evening, she came from Sicily, same as some of you. She remembered being hungry as a child, real hunger. She'd tell us stories, make sure we never wasted food. But even she'd be amazed at what we have now. America in the 20s and 30s, during the Depression, that was hard. Plenty of hunger then. But the war changed everything. The factories are running 24 hours. Everyone has work. The pay is good. Food is rationed for civilians now, but the rations are generous. Nobody's starving. Bellini asked the question that had been haunting him. How? How does America do this? Italy is ancient. We have history, culture, civilization, going back thousands of years. America is, what, less than 200 years old? How does a young nation become so powerful so quickly? Russo thought carefully before answering. I'm just a private. I don't have all the answers. But I think it's because in America we started fresh. No kings, no aristocracy, no ancient feuds. We built everything new, with machines and factories and modern thinking. And we're huge, right? Massive farms, lots of people, lots of resources. Plus, we take in people from everywhere. My grandparents were Italian. Other guys in my unit, their families came from Ireland, Germany, Poland, everywhere. All those people brought ideas and worked together. And the system we have, the democracy, capitalism, whatever you want to call it creates wealth. Not for everyone equally, but there's opportunity. People work hard because they benefit from the work. It wasn't a complete explanation, Bellini knew. But it contained truth. Italy's industrial weakness wasn't an accident or temporary condition. It reflected centuries of political fragmentation, resistance to modernization, concentration of wealth among aristocracy, insufficient investment in education and infrastructure. Italian unification had occurred only in 1861, and the process had left deep regional divisions. Fascism had promised to overcome these obstacles through nationalist fervor and authoritarian efficiency. Instead, it had squandered resources on military adventures Italy couldn't sustain. Bellini spent his remaining time in POW camps working agricultural details, helping bring in harvests of wheat and vegetables that would feed American troops. The American farms themselves were revelations, mechanization everywhere. Tractors that could plow in a day what would take a team of oxen a week, combines that harvested and threshed in single operations. Irrigation systems, chemical fertilizers, hybrid seeds developed through scientific research. American agriculture had become an industrial process, producing food at scales Italian farmers couldn't imagine. He watched American soldiers operate, noting their efficiency, their casual competence with machinery, their systematic approach to problems. These weren't supermen. They were ordinary people, many of them farm boys and factory workers, but they'd been given tools, training, and most importantly, proper nutrition. Well-fed soldiers thought more clearly, moved more quickly, recovered from exertion faster. The advantage compounded across every aspect of military operations. By November of 1943, the Italian campaign had stalled in difficult terrain south of Rome. American and Allied forces fought through mountain ranges and river crossings against determined German resistance. Italian co-belligerent forces, those who'd sided with the Allies after the armistice, fought alongside the Americans, finally adequately fed and equipped. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Italian POWs sat in camps across North Africa and southern Italy, processing what they'd witnessed. For Sergeant Marco Bellini, the transformation was complete. He'd entered the war as a true believer in fascist ideology, convinced that Italian martial spirit and historical greatness would carry the day. He'd fought in North Africa, watched Italian forces crumble, experienced the slow starvation of inadequate rations, and finally surrendered on a beach south of Salerno. In American captivity, eating more than he had in years, he'd confronted the fundamental delusion that had sent Italy into a war it could never win. The Americans had won before the first shot was fired, won through factory production and agricultural abundance and systematic logistics. They'd won through a political and economic system that, whatever its flaws, generated wealth and distributed it widely enough that working-class immigrants could eat meat regularly and consider buying automobiles. They'd won because their soldiers marched on 4,000 calories a day, while Italian soldiers starved on less than 2,000. In December of 1943, Bellini was transferred to a larger POW facility in Algeria. There, among thousands of other Italian prisoners, he encountered men from every theatre of Italy's war. The North Africa veterans told stories of thirst and hunger in the desert. The men from Russia described cold and starvation beyond imagination. The soldiers from the Balkans reported watching German allies eat while Italians went hungry. Every account confirmed the same truth. Italy had sent men to fight without the basic industrial capacity to sustain military operations. The camp had a small library, stocked with Italian language books provided by relief organizations. Bellini began reading history, trying to understand how Italy had arrived at this catastrophe. He read about Italian unification, the disappointments of the liberal period, the rise of fascism as a response to post-World War I chaos. He read about Italian industrial development, which had advanced but never caught up to Northern European standards. He read about agriculture, about the persistent poverty of the Mezzogiorno, about the emigration of millions of Italians to America and Argentina, seeking opportunities that didn't exist at home. The reading provided context but not comfort. Italy's weakness wasn't new. Fascism hadn't created the underlying problems, though it had certainly made them worse through corruption, mismanagement, and grandiose military ambitions that outstripped capabilities. The war had simply exposed what should have been obvious all along. Italy lacked the resources to fight as a great power. The food told that story in the most direct way possible. You couldn't feed an army adequately because the industrial and agricultural base didn't support it. Bellini wrote letters home, though he knew they'd be censored. He told his family he was safe and well fed. He didn't mention the larger revelations. Those would have to wait for his return, assuming he ever returned. In the meantime, he ate American rations, worked American farms, and watched American efficiency, with a mixture of admiration and deep, abiding anger at the leaders who'd sent Italian men into an unwinnable war. The conversations among prisoners turned increasingly political. Some remained loyal to fascism, blaming defeat on betrayal or German incompetence or bad luck. Others, like Bellini, recognized that the entire ideology had been bankrupt from the beginning. A few began studying American democracy, communism, socialism, trying to understand what political system might serve Italy better in the future. Whatever came next, everyone agreed that fascism was finished. The food alone testified to its failure. Among the conversations, one moment stood out for Bellini. A young prisoner from Calabria, barely 20 years old, asked him a simple question. "Sergeant, why did we fight? What was it all for?" Bellini had no good answer. He'd believed the propaganda about reviving Roman greatness, about Italy's right to empire, about the need for expansion. None of it made sense anymore. "We fought," he said finally, "because we were told to. We believed what we were told. We trusted our leaders. That was our mistake." Nodded slowly. "Will we make that mistake again?" "I hope not," Bellini said, "but that depends on us, on whether we remember what we learned here, on whether we remember that you can't build greatness on lies, and you can't win wars when your soldiers are starving." As autumn turned to winter in 1943, the Italian campaign ground forward through difficult terrain. Rome would fall in June 1944. The war in Italy would continue until German forces finally surrendered in May 1945. Hundreds of thousands of Italian POWs would remain in Allied camps throughout the war, many of them working in labor battalions, all of them eating better as prisoners than they ever had as soldiers. The story of Italian soldiers witnessing American rations might seem like a footnote, a small detail in a much larger war. But for the men who lived it, the revelation was fundamental. It explained their defeat more clearly than any battlefield analysis could. It exposed the lies they'd been fed about American weakness and Italian strength. It demonstrated the consequences of industrial inadequacy and agricultural backwardness. Most importantly, it provided a visceral, undeniable understanding of why the war had been lost before it began. Sergeant Marco Bellini would return to Italy after the war ended, part of the slow repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Italian POWs. He'd find his village largely intact, but poverty-stricken. He'd marry, start a family, work a small farm with methods that hadn't changed in generations. He'd watch as American aid under the Marshall Plan helped rebuild Italian infrastructure. He'd see democracy, however imperfect, replace dictatorship. He'd live long enough to witness the Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, when industrialization and modernization finally transformed Italian society. But he never forgot the lesson learned on that morning in September 1943, sitting as a prisoner outside Salerno, watching an American private open a tin can and offer him food. The lesson that power wasn't about speeches or propaganda or martial spirit. Power was about production, abundance, the ability to feed your soldiers 4,000 calories a day and still have enough left over to feed your enemies. Power was having so much that you could afford to be generous, even to those who'd recently been trying to kill you. The Italian soldiers who witnessed American GI rations understood, with the clarity that comes from hunger, that they'd been fighting for a government that couldn't perform the most basic function of any military power, keeping its soldiers adequately fed. That understanding rippled through Italian society after the war, contributing to the rejection of fascism and the embrace, however tentative, of democracy and Western alliance. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't universal. But for thousands of Italian veterans, the war had ended not on some battlefield but in a moment of recognition, watching Americans casually waste food that would have been precious beyond measure. The disparity was never really about calories, though the numbers told their own story. 4,000 American calories against 1,800 Italian calories. It was about two fundamentally different worlds, one capable of producing abundance, the other barely managing survival. The food was simply evidence, the most immediate and undeniable proof of a larger truth, that Italy had gambled on war with cards it didn't hold, and hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers had paid the price of that delusion with their hunger, their suffering, and too often, their lives. In prisoner of war camps across North Africa and Italy, former Italian soldiers ate American rations and understood what their own government had never been willing to admit. They'd never had a chance. The understanding was bitter, but it came with the peculiar relief of finally knowing the truth. Better to know you were beaten by overwhelming material superiority than to believe you'd lost because you weren't brave enough or hadn't tried hard enough. The Americans had won because America could feed its soldiers. Italy had lost because it couldn't. In the end, the war had been decided not by strategy or tactics or fighting spirit, but by something as simple and profound as bread, meat, and the calories needed to keep men functioning. The Italian soldiers understood this truth, carried it home with them, and helped build a different Italy in the decades that followed. An Italy that learned, painfully and slowly, that national greatness couldn't be built on empty promises and emptier stomachs. An Italy that understood the cost of lies and the value of uncomfortable truths. The lesson had been purchased with hunger and defeat, but at least it had been learned. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.